How we all feeling right now? Yeah, I told you there would be some feels related to this movie, right? And the words that come to mind for me are sort of beautiful and tragic, and I want to sort of talk about this film, what it means, and with our phenomenal panelists here. Let's get started with that. I just like Barry Jenkins, y'all. Like, just as a filmmaker, we showed Moonlight as part of this series. Barry Jenkins keeps making movies, we're gonna keep showing them, so just get ready for that. We have this panel, and we have a limited amount of time, so I want to, I did a brief intro at the onset. I'm wondering if we can start, Radha, with you and sort of do your own introduction, as it were, and just tell us a little bit about your story, what brings you here, and your sort of connection to this film, to this work.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Radha Natarajan, and I'm the executive director of the New England Innocence Project. And I'm really grateful to see so many people here interested in not only this film, but also the issue of wrongful convictions, of race, of misidentifications, which is a part of this film, which is also an issue that I have spent most of my career focusing on. It's one of the issues that is one of the major contributing causes of wrongful convictions. This film, I think, brings so much about the work, but just, in terms of my own, what brings me to the work, prior to becoming the executive director of the New England Innocence Project, I was a public defender in Suffolk and Middlesex County. So that's basically, I was a Roxbury defender, and then also in Somerville, so in Massachusetts. And the issues that are inherent in the criminal legal system, so not just issues of wrongful conviction, but issues of mass incarceration and issues of, what happens, how do you deal with family members who are in pretrial? How do you handle cases when you're charged with something? How do you handle the pressures of the system and all the powers of the state on you, on your family, on the community, and how do you fight back against that, and can you? And in the end, can an individual do that, even with all the support? These are all issues that sort of bring me to the work. So anyways, I think the film brings out a number of these issues, and I'm looking forward to talking more about them.
Great, thanks. Please welcome Radha Natarajan. Dr. Symes.
Hi, my name is Jessica Symes. I'm a professor at Boston University, and I'm a sociologist, and my research and career has been focused on understanding racial disparities in incarceration. I also have written about James Baldwin, who is often thought of as a literary figure, but has offered many really insightful observations about society and social conditions, and I think we could think of him as a bit as a sociologist himself. And what's remarkable to me about this film is, so If Beale Street Could Talk was written in 1974, and from 1900 till about 1970, the rate of incarceration was pretty stable. The first half of the 20th century, we saw an era of relative stability, and then from about 1970 onward, the rate of incarceration more than quadrupled. And so currently we have about 2.23 million people incarcerated, and there's about 10 million jail incarcerations a year. So in a way, James Baldwin was a bit prophetic and a bit prescient, understood something about the nature of incarceration and how it impacted communities, in particular communities. And so today, we think of mass incarceration as a term we say often, and it's comprised of kind of two parts. One is this dramatic rise. It rose more than 400% since the time of the writing of this book. And the other piece to it, though, is that it affected particular groups, that there's an intensive racial disparity in incarceration. And so those two things come together, and what it means is Tish and Fani are part of now an entire community that's impacted by the criminal justice system. And one of the things I put out there is, I think what's really interesting is the focus is on a couple where we sort of understand that innocence is a big part of the story, but I sort of put on the table what kind of justice system would we want, where we would really take seriously the experiences of all people involved, and how does this film sort of shed light on some of the ways in which the way we incarcerate is harmful, separating families, keeping communities apart, keeping children from their parents, and how could we together envision a criminal justice system that is less harmful and actually heals and contributes to communities coming together. So, yeah.
All right. Dr. Jessica Symes, thank you. And as you talk about Baldwin also, I just want to shout out the person I saw in the back literally reading Baldwin before the movie started. I see you, and I appreciate you. That's right. All right, Mr. Frederick Clark.
Yes, my name is Frederick Clay. I did 38 years in prison for a crime I did not commit. Watching this film sort of reminded me of a couple of things. First, I thought he was kind of very lucky to have family support. I did not have that. His mother, in-law, I should say, sort of went out of her way to go to Puerto Rico to try to, convince the witness to, change her testimony, recant her statement. That did not happen in my case, obviously. He just had a lot more family support than I had, and it sort of reminded me of that, how lack of family support I did have. Also, it sort of reminded me too that he had a good woman, and they was expecting a child, and I definitely didn't have that, and still don't. But at the same time, it made me realize that at the time I was doing all those years, I'm sort of glad that I did not have that, because it would have made the time much more harder than it was. I grew up without a father. I never knew my father, and if I had a kid, I would have been out of that, my daughter or son's life for 38 years, and that would have had impact on them as well as me and the woman that I would have had a baby with. So I'm sort of in a way, glad that I didn't have to go through that. A lot of guys that I knew in prison went through that, and they was telling me about those things, and I could see how it affected them and how they did time. So that was something I was sort of always grateful for in the back of my mind. But at the same time, watching this film, it reminds me of the family connection, and it reminds me that eyewitness identification, which he had in this case, was similar to mine. Obviously, I wasn't doing time for rape, but I was doing time for murder. It was based on eyewitness identification, solely on identified, there was no physical evidence tying me to the crime. So that aspect of the story sort of resonated with me too. And sometimes how it is hard to convince people that they didn't see what they thought that they saw. So it sort of reminds me of some of those things watching this film.
Mr. Frederick Clay. So we think about this idea around eyewitness identification, and I know, Radha, this is something that you've studied and also teach as well. Can you tell us a little bit more about where we were back then and where we are now, and how prevalent is this of an issue? I mean, as we think about people being wrongfully convicted, can you kind of walk us through eyewitness identification, but also other ways that people are wrongfully convicted today?
How much time you got?
We got a little bit of time.
We've learned a lot about what causes or what are the red flags of wrongful conviction based on the number of wrongful convictions that we know about. And there are many, many that we don't know about because, for example, in this case, we have a situation where someone who's innocent pled guilty and nobody considers him an exoneree, right? The person in this story. So nobody is studying it. Nobody is looking into what happened. Well, the only data that we have are for the ones who are actually exonerated, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. But for those cases, we have data about what are some of the red flags. And eyewitness identification, unreliable informant testimony, flawed forensics, false confessions. I mean, these are some of the main red flags. And of course, some of the issues that, are not talked about or are not put up there, but are obviously incredibly relevant are race, tunnel vision, things that are sort of human factors. And I think what it all comes down to is that, we have systems that rely on humans that are unreliable because that's we are obviously prone to error. And so with respect to eyewitness identification, we have known, or the scientists who study memory have known for a very, very long time that memory is flawed, and there are or is prone to error in different circumstances. So there are some things that are sort of more obvious. So if it's dark versus if it's light, of course you're going to have a more difficult time. If it's a stranger versus someone you're going to have a more difficult time. But then there's lots of other factors that are less well known. So for a long time, there was, and especially in criminal trials, there was a myth that was put forward in trials that when someone has gone through a stressful experience, that trauma of going through a stressful experience burns the image of the person in their brain such that they will never forget that face. And that mantra was spoken over and over again in criminal trials. I would never forget that face. And yet we know from cases and from studies that that's not only not true, but that stress actually makes it more difficult for people to remember faces of people that they don't know. And so there's these common misconceptions about how memory works that still is pervasive actually today in criminal trials, and it varies. Criminal justice or the way criminal justice works is very local. So each jurisdiction has different rules. So the way eyewitness memory is treated and the way eyewitness evidence is treated is different. In Massachusetts, we've made some significant strides in the last several years. And the reason why we've made strides is because we've started looking at the science. And so I think one of the themes to pay attention to is that when we're faithful to the science, when we pay attention to the science, and when we're trying to make sure that what comes into the courtrooms is reliable, that's when we can ensure the best results. And I think in the past, it wasn't about looking at reliability, but just about, let's just leave it to the jury to say, who do they believe? And that's not how we get accurate results, as we know.
Thank you. And Jessica, thinking about the system sort of writ large, and my understanding is that 95% of cases are actually plead out that don't actually go to trial, and that of the folks we know that have been exonerated, 15% of them actually pled guilty to the crime they did not commit. Can you sort of walk us through again, and we've got a little bit of time, can you walk us through again some of the issues around, is this aggressive prosecution? Like, where should we be looking as we look to reform the system around this specific issue?
I think it's a really important question. When we imagine justice, we imagine a trial and a whole sort of set of figures who are invested in finding out the truth. And in reality, because of the crushing weight of this custodial imperative that police are bringing people in and the courts need to process them and the prisons need to keep them, there's very little infrastructure and resources to actually produce those outcomes. Just the idea that there's 10 million jail admissions a year, there's absolutely no way that each and every person could receive a fair trial. And I think what it asks is, how did we get to this point where we have it's always been racially disparate, but when you map on these rates, it becomes a community experience. It becomes something so profound, and to have these significantly high concentrations in particular communities means that whole communities are experiencing this sort of lack of justice, and that pleading guilty is sometimes for them the best option out of a set of, this is why I go back to this larger question. It's, if we're gonna think of mass incarceration as a historic injustice, how do we envision a system? Is the system, if it worked, if it were less people, but it was this system, would this be a just system? I don't know. I think we'd have to envision something kind of radically different, even if we could process everyone and give everyone a trial. I'm not so sure that that's the system we would want. I think you would have a lot more to say too about sort of pleading and how that sort of experience goes when you're working with as a former defense attorney in the public defenders.
Well, as far as admitting to something that you not do, back in 1979, I was 16 years old, being charged with murder. Obviously, I was scared out of my mind. But at the same time, I know I did not do it, and why would I voluntarily put myself in prison for something I did not do? I didn't really think that was an option for me, and I still don't think it's an option. People do, when they being interrogated and the officers are doing all kind of crazy time that the person is facing, people look, listen to that and they get scared. And sometimes they realize that, maybe if I take a deal, then I'm going to do less time than a natural life. And I thought about that for 2 minutes. And realized that that's not an option for me. So I did not do it, regardless of how scared I was by them telling me that, Mr. Clay, well, if you plead out, we'll give you manslaughter, we'll give you second degree. Yeah, that might be true, but at the same time, I'm still putting myself in prison for something I did not do. And I'm doing that voluntarily. And I figure if I take my chances to go to trial, at least I was being told that it was a 50-50 chance that I might be found not guilty. So I'd rather take those odds. At least I know I'm still standing up for the truth and I'm standing up for my belief, and I'm not voluntarily put myself in prison. So for me, that was not a choice. But for other people, they get scared and they start thinking about their lives and all that stuff. So that's their choice. So I really can't fault them for making the best choice for themselves.
I want to add a sort of a footnote to Fred's story. If Fred had pled guilty to something that he did not do, he would have spent less time in prison than he did as an innocent man who had a trial with all of the protections, with a lawyer, with a jury, with appeals, right? Yes. And so, a judge went to the courts that looked at his conviction, that, and all of the protections that our criminal legal system are supposed to have in order to prevent this from happening. And Fred spent 38 years in prison. So if he had pled guilty to something that he didn't do, he would have spent less time. And I think that is an important thing, in that we clap that Fred did not plead guilty. And I also will say, for folks who did plead guilty to things that they didn't do, it's not always an irrational choice as well. The coercion and the power of the system makes you do that, even though that also is doesn't make sense in a lot of ways.
Thank you. Fred, continuing with you, can you tell us now that you've been out? I mean, so you're released, and then you've got to go back to court, yes, for restitution afterwards. There's been a process, some kind of process in order to seek restitution. I don't know if that's something that you can talk about. Compensation, sorry. Something that you can talk about.
It's still been in process of finalizing things, but yes, no matter how much money they offer me or I'm requesting, it's not going to replace 38 years out of my life. So, but just to try to get the money, I mean, as far as I know, some people don't get it, but at least, it's being talked about, or at least I think it's been agreed that I might get some money. So just to hear that conversation is being discussed, it's been kind of uplifting, but at the same time, it makes me realize that, again, no amount of money is going to replace 38 years, but it gives me a little cushion to think about other opportunities that can come out of this. So I'm trying to focus on that. But it's not about the money. For me personally, if they come out and just immediately admit that I did not, receive a fair trial and that justice was not done, tell you the truth, I'd be satisfied with that. But the way it came out was totally different than what I expected, but that's still, I was happy for the end result. But to get money is great, but at the same time, I'm not really dependent on that. I'm sort of still living my life like that's not in the cards, that's not in the mix. I'm working and trying to rebuild my life. That's what I'm focusing on. I'm trying to stay focused on that.
Appreciate you, brother. Thank you. We're going to throw it to you all in just a second, so have your questions ready. I've got sort of one last question. Maybe Jessica, start with you here, is, I appreciate what you said about sort of we need to sort of reimagine our system. There's talks of there's been some criminal justice reform here in Massachusetts, and there's been talks of criminal justice reform federally. How far away or close to, well, I think far away, by the look on your face, how far away from where we need to be are we now, and what steps do we need to take to get there in your view? Well,
hearing this word compensation, to me, the problem of mass incarceration, I think, begs an even deeper kind of response, maybe something that looks like reparations for whole communities that experience this. One of the most striking pieces about this film for me as a sociologist is how well James Baldwin and the filmmakers really demonstrated that a person going to prison doesn't just affect that person. It has this reverberation through an entire family. I mean, his fiance's mother flies to Puerto Rico to get him, help find this witness. I mean, those are things that families go to these lengths for each other. And when someone goes to prison, I've interviewed many people who've been incarcerated and their family members, and just understanding how impactful this is, not just for the people who are incarcerated, but also their loved ones who lose a family member and deal with the trauma of that as well. So when I think of incremental changes like decriminalization of particular drugs, or reducing or eliminating mandatory minimum sentences, or releasing people because there's overcrowding and degrading conditions in prisons, or these sorts of things that are sort of happening very rapidly and kind of ad hoc and without a national conversation about how this was a profound statement about this country decided to respond to crime in this particular racialized way, and that it's this long-standing unresolved matter of race that was imprinted on this system, and it spread beyond Black communities, beyond it's an enormous system. You can find it in rural Indiana and white communities. You can find jail incarceration rates in South Dakota, where it's an incredibly pervasive problem that goes to the heart of some pretty big unresolved matters of race and inequality. And so I think these changes are good, these little changes, but I think we could imagine criminal justice reform as also being, family welfare reform. It could also be healthcare reform. It could also be a whole host of things. We could think much more broadly about what justice actually means.
We're going to throw to the audience. Radha, if you have anything to add there, or Fred, please do.
Personally, I'm not sure. I really don't know too much about this reform. But I hope that there's something in there with juveniles, because I was a juvenile, I was 16 years old, and ended up getting a natural life sentence at the age of 17 years old and put it in state prison, Walpole State Prison at the age of 17. So personally for me, in my case, the judge decided that a 16-year-old kid is not able to change, is not capable of changing. So therefore, we're gonna just give up on you and put you in prison for the rest of your life. So I think some type of justice reform needs to be addressed towards juveniles, just to look at how they was raised, their family life, and just try to deal with them as human beings and not as other people might think, as a monster or something lower than the curve. So I think it should be some type of reform in there, addressing juveniles and how, especially when they saying the juvenile brain is not fully developed until the age of 21, 25, or whatever the age is. So, but to take a kid, for me, it took me out of a bad situation, and it put me even in a worse situation by putting me in a state prison. A lot of people don't survive prison. A lot of people go to prison, but they don't survive prison. So, and I was kind of wondering about if I was going to survive, whether I was going to die in there and everything else. So just that type of trauma, it needs to be addressed when they're dealing with juveniles, especially when they're talking about giving them a natural life sentence and putting them in prison, or even for any type of crime.
I think one thing is that maybe if everyone here agrees not to use the term criminal justice system, it's a small thing, but it starts a conversation. We don't have a criminal justice system. There is no justice in this system. We can call it a criminal legal system, that's what it is. We can call it a criminal punishment system, we can call it something else, but it's not a criminal justice system. That's not what creates the results that we have, so let's agree not to do that.
Okay, questions from you all? I see some hands.
Hi, I wanted to know, I guess there are a lot of really big picture things that it seems like need to be changed, but what would you recommend that we can do, especially for those of us who are like students? I mean, for instance, like I can't be a lawyer and help get people out of jail. I'm an undergrad, but like what can we do?
One thing I try to do is listen to people who actually experienced it, and experience incarceration and experience the criminal legal system. People have the answers to this and know how to heal from this and know what can be done. And I think all of us can, for those of us who have not been involved in the criminal, been processed through this system, we can see this film, but we can hear these types of panels, but then we really need to draw on the wisdom and the creativity and the expertise of the people who've been involved in, and that's to me what is really important and contributing to those spaces in which those voices can be heard most.
What can be done? First of all, I know this is sort of oversaid a lot in today's justice system, or what's that word? Criminal legal system. But when people say that they actually are innocent, I know that's thrown around a lot, but sometimes they actually mean that they are innocent, in my case. So I would think that for me personally, just to have someone listen to me back then, and really take into account what I was saying and really believe what I was saying was true. But even if they doubted me, still just show concern, show some type of compassion. I think that it might not solve things, but it get people interested. It get the person talking about their life, about their case. So at least they have someone that they feel is care about them and listen and want to listen to them. And just sometimes just to have that ear, it helps the person deal with the situation much more better than they already are. If I'd had that back then, I might have would have dealt with a lot of things a lot differently. Instead of just shutting down and putting up a wall and trying to keep people away in a way that was hurting me when I should have been advocating for myself. And I realize that now. So, but to answer your question, I think just to have someone there listen to you, and not only you listen, they listen to you, but you take what they say and try to contact people that you think can help. Word of mouth goes a long way. So that's my 2 cents.
Hi, this is a question for Fred Clay. I wanted to know if, I know that in the 38 years that you were away, there are probably many, many people that you've encountered who are like you. Do you have communication with those people, and are you trying to help people who are like you, who are in prison, who are innocent?
To answer your first question, there is some people that I met last year in Tennessee with the Innocent Network Conference that just sort of been in my situation. Everybody had their own individual cases and circumstances why they end up in prison, but the overall thing that we had in common is that we was all innocent. So a lot of people that I've met in Tennessee have reached out to me, gave me their contact number, and I gave them mine. And occasionally, when I get out of my own head about things and I think about them, I do call them and try to ask them questions that might be on my mind, how they dealt with things, and do they have some advice, or just if they need to talk about something. It's just not only about me, it's about them as well. So if they need to talk about something, I'm there for them. So I just try to reconnect with them and strengthen that bond. And to answer your second question, I have just started doing some internship with this Thrive community program that I got involved with when I came out of prison. It's sort of like a program that helped returning citizens to get acclimated back in society. So I was a member for a year for that program. There's still some things that we still got to follow up on to help me, but they helped me a lot. And I'm sort of giving back, and people are coming out of prison now. I'm trying to help them. Matter of fact, we're supposed to have a workshop that's going to be scheduled on March 30th about situations surrounding housing and how difficult it is for a person to come out of prison and get housing. So I'm putting a workshop together, try to get information on that to share with the people that's coming out of prison. So that's just my way of giving back. I'm just starting with that. It might lead to something more that I want to do, but you got to start somewhere, and that's where I'm starting.
Hi, I just want to say thank you so much for being here tonight and having this venue. My question is, to my understanding, I believe that there isn't a mandatory law for them to fully tape the interrogation when a witness is being interrogated. I think they just passed a law for minors, which they didn't have, but how close are we to getting that for adults, to having that mandatory tape to help innocent people when they go to trial?
It varies across the country, across jurisdiction. In Massachusetts, we don't have a law that requires that interrogations or statements that people make about their cases are videotaped and are video recorded, so that people know whether or not they made a false confession, or whether it's an accurate confession, whether there was coercion, or all of those things. That's not required. However, there was a decision, a legal decision that was made that that said that if a confession or an admission is not recorded, that you are entitled to a jury instruction. And so if you go to trial and the prosecution wants to admit a statement against you that you made, that you're entitled to a jury instruction saying that the jury can make a negative inference that they did not record it. What all that means is basically that it looks bad if they don't record it, basically. And this actually just just the court saying that made many police departments voluntarily begin recording interrogations, even though it's not required under the law. And so while we don't have data on exactly how many departments are recording and not recording, I think anecdotally we can say that the majority of police departments are recording in Massachusetts interrogations. And this applies, across the board, whether it's juvenile or adults. There has been some discussion about whether or not there's a need for mandatory recording laws. In other states, they don't have, this jury instruction or any sort of incentive for voluntary compliance, and so they may have either the need for mandatory recordings or a mandatory recording law or something else, and so it kind of varies. And so that deals with sort of the false confessions questions. But I will say that, even if what's recorded, what gets recorded, there could be something that happens before the tape gets turned on that is not recorded. And those are just things that, frankly, we just can't ever capture. It's just, there's never going to be a world where we're going to know everything. Everything's not going to be captured on camera. We're always going to have to rely on witness memory, witness accounts for some part of a criminal case.
It's a good time to recognize, he's looking down right now, but our state rep, if you live in Brookline, and he's my state rep, Tommy Vitola over here, who I hear listening intently to what you have to say. So we start to think about the legislature.
You should have told me that before.
Right.
I hope this isn't too technical, but I'm curious as to whether bench trials produce a better result in terms of exonerating innocent defendants than jury trials.
I don't think we have data on that. I think that if you do go to trial, and again, most cases don't go to trial, although there is some data to suggest that people who do end up going to trial, that there may be a higher percentage of innocent people who actually do end up going to trial. There is some data to suggest that. In any case, I think typically that the wisdom, or the common wisdom or whatever, is that, especially when I was a public defender, is that it's better to have 12 people making the decision than one. I think it of course varies, but I don't personally know of any data that suggests that you would get more reliable results from a judge trial versus a jury trial. The only exception to that I will say is that cases that rely very heavily on something, a legal finding that's very, very technical, that requires expertise that a judge may know versus a jury, or something that you think a jury would be very biased against, and for some reason the judge wouldn't be, or for some reason what the judge would make as an outcome because of something that has been said prior, so that's sort of something that's foretold to you. Those are sort of exceptions. I think in general you would think that a jury of 12 would you sort of take your chances there, but I think either way you're taking your chances.
I think we have time for just the one more question. Mark says 2, and we'll keep the questions brief and our responses relatively brief, with the exception of Fred. You take as long as you want.
Hi, Mr. Clay. Thank you so much for being here today, and sincerely sorry for what happened to you. I think we're all grateful just to hear what you've been through today. And I know somebody asked what students can do, but when I look around this room, there's a lot of different ages, races. I mean, it's a rainbow in here, truly. But what can adults do? Some decision makers. I'm sure there are some people in here who are managers and lawmakers. What can some of the adults do here to really help and move this conversation forward and make a difference?
If I had that answer, I'd be teaching law school. But personally, for me, just having this conversation and not only just keep the conversation, sort of confined to this place, take it out and like senators and just talk to people that you think can have an impact, or people that you might know that might be in a profession, a legal profession. Just make people aware of it. Every day I'm not really active on Facebook, but a lot of people, every time I go on Facebook, I'm seeing people being let out of prison for, after 20 years, 30 years, whatever the time, keep changing. But the fact of the matter is that they were sent to prison for something they did not do. So it's not like this is not new. This has been happening for many decades, long before I was born. So people need, even though a lot of people are aware of it, but obviously people need to be more aware of it. So I just think just by having this conversations and showing films like this and word of mouth, as I mentioned earlier, goes a long way. So, but as students, if you're thinking about getting into the legal profession, as I said earlier, if you have a client that says that they're innocent, they need to be looked at. The word justice has been thrown around a lot, and that word itself needs to be looked at. People take oaths to uphold the law. Police officers, district attorneys, everybody in that area take an oath to uphold the law. And sending innocent people to prison, justice is not being served to me, to that person, to the victim's family. All the way around there's injustice. So just to have those type of conversations, it might wake people up, and it could happen to you. You gotta think about that too. I woke up on November 16th in a foster home, got kicked out the foster home, went to see my probation officer to let her know about my situation, not knowing that I'm gonna get arrested for murder. That never crossed my mind. So I'm saying that to say this: when you step out that door, you don't know what's gonna happen to you. So I'm not saying put yourself in the same situation, but realize that you yourself are not exempt. So if we think about that more, then I think people will start to have a different idea about justice, or the lack of it, I should say.
Just that. I just wanted to say a couple things now that I know there's someone with a bit of power in the room. There are so many changes that we could see, and Massachusetts, could really lead the torch. We talk a lot about there's a big, massive criminal justice reform happening at the federal level, but there are 50, state prison systems and criminal justice systems that are doing this. And Massachusetts has a real opportunity to make some massive inroads on things like bail reform, fines, and fees. I've met people who can't get a driver's license, and so then they can't get a job, so that they can't meet their parole expectations. We have some pretty unbelievable expectations on people coming out of prison, and how they're supposed to get their lives together, and we make it harder by imposing fines, by making it incredibly hard to get their driver's licenses. The housing requirements on parolees is incredibly challenging, making you can't be found with somebody who has a criminal record, or in a lot of cases, in a lot of situations. So people are entangled in all of these unbelievable bureaucratic and non-criminal acts that can send them back to prison. And Massachusetts could make massive changes on just that, because indeed people go to prison because they've been convicted, but there are millions of people who are in jails awaiting trial, and that's because we don't have good bail reform, and we really could make some differences in people's lives, because jails are degrading and incredibly inhumane places. And we put people there while they await trial, and it's something that we could really make a difference in people's lives. And the other thing I want to say is we've talked a lot, again, I mentioned this in my first remarks, but we've talked a lot about innocent people. There are guilty people too, though, who don't need to go through these conditions. And so it's really important to think about the humanity that we could express in our institutions if we wanted to. And that goes for everybody, not just the people who are innocent, but people who might have done really, really difficult, really, even violent things. We have to think about them having humanity as well. Thanks.
So I think obviously raising awareness and keeping informed. There is a mass exoneration podcast, massexoneration.com, which tells some of the stories of some of the local exonerees, including Fred, in their own words and the words of their supporters and family members and other loved ones. And so listen to the podcast and hear more about their stories and pass it along to your friends. Number two, to be really educated voters, especially about your district attorneys. District attorneys play an extremely, extremely significant role in what happens in the criminal legal system. So please be an educated voter. Don't think that those elections don't matter. They do. I think we should all know how much elections matter. Number three, we have very significant legislative issues that are that are happening right now. We have legislation that's pending about the reliability of testifying informants, which I mentioned earlier, is one of the most prevalent causes of wrongful convictions. That's pending in our State House right now. We have legislation about recording of interrogations. We have legislation to make better the compensation for wrongfully convicted people like Fred and other folks that we have in Massachusetts. So there is legislation that's relevant, as well as other legislation that's important for people, not just innocent people. And the other thing is, donate to your local bail fund, of course, to the New England Innocence Project, but it's really important to think about organizations who are doing good work. But definitely, if you don't know, the local bail funds are the ones that are helping people who are presumed innocent and are fighting while they're in jail, so they don't have to be coerced into taking pleas, so they can fight while they're out. And most of those cases end up getting dismissed. And if they weren't out, then they would have taken a plea, and many bad consequences come as a result of that. So think about that as well.
Thank you. All right, so Mark says we've got time for one more question, and I want to then, make sure we have time so you can meet some of these fine folks before we all head home. So we'll take this last question.
Once again, thank you for taking the time to be here, to the three of you. And I was going to ask about the economic aspects like bail reform and stuff, but you guys kind of just covered that. So I wanted to ask about the concept of private prisons and the fact that there's people who profit off of people being incarcerated. And if you can just maybe break down, how is this still allowed? How can someone be making a living, a pretty wealthy living, out of the fact that a lot of these people are staying out of the system, out of their own lives, without freedom? And perhaps are there things being done to combat that, and what things can be done in that regard? In regards to privatized prisons.
Well, less than 10% of prisons are privatized. And I say that not because I think private prisons are okay. I think they're sort of this, the problem with them is this perverse incentive that if we have privately run prisons, they'll want to keep people in longer, they'll have a reason to stay open. But to me, the scarier thing about the other 91%, is that the state and elected officials and people who serve in public office and people who are paid with tax dollars are largely, what this prison system is comprised of. And so I think it's not to say that there aren't private interests, that there aren't financial interests in maintaining the criminal justice system, but the vast majority of it was a state decision. It was a policy decision. It wasn't just capitalism, and it's growing. There's also quite a bit of private prisons in kind of specialty prisons, if you will, such as immigrant detention and juvenile prisons are often run by private, but the adult prison system is largely run by people who are paid by tax dollars. And so I think that leaves us with a really deep question of kind of how do we put an end to something that is intertwined into the fabric of our very own institutions, and not just, if we just regulated a private market, we would get into a better place. It's actually much more challenging, I think, to close prisons that are run by state governments, that have people who are part of unions, that have, in some parts of the country, the only job available is working in criminal justice as a probation officer. And so it's this massive question about kind of the carving out of, good jobs and good institutions. We could have built an entire enormous welfare state, and instead we built an enormous prison state. And it was our state institutions that did that. So, but I think it's a really good question, and it's something we should keep in our minds, is sort of what does it mean to have a portion of our people in private prisons?
I really don't know too much about the privatization of it, but I do know in most state prisons, it might not be privately owned, but the canteen and the prisons are privately owned. They make a lot of money with the canteens, and they can raise prices anytime they want to. So it becomes a monopoly. It's like racketeering legalized, And so it's wrong, but that's the way it is. And when I first went to prison, the prisons themselves owned the canteen. So whatever money they made, they invested back into the prison to get better products for the inmates. But now it's become much more capitalized, much more money involved. So money drives a lot of people to do certain things, and prisons is no exception to that. But I really don't know to answer that question. I guess you would have to try to take money out of the situation and make people think about the human part of it, That I think that needs to be focused on a little bit more. Because some of these people, their family members can be in prison too, and they still got to deal with that. So it's affected them personally, and yet they still take a blind eye to that.
Thank you. For any of you, anything else before we go that you want to share with the people that you want them to know?
Don't try to get out of jury duty.
I just want to put a plug back to the first question about what can you do. Thrive Communities is an amazing organization, and there's many more like it, where anyone can get involved and be a part of helping to restore justice in our communities. So it's called Thrive Communities. It's based in Lowell, but there's other organizations like it in the area, and it's an incredible organization that asks, you don't have to have any specialization. You're just a member of the community who wants to help somebody feel like they have a community and a network surrounding them, and it's a beautiful organization. And I was actually one of the people that helped found that organization a few years ago.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Wow.
So I put a plug for Thrive. Yeah.
For me personally, I think that every person that goes to prison has a docket number, has a con number that's associated with them. That's sort of like identification to who they are. And I think people need to look at that and realize that there's a person behind that, there's a story behind that. And that's what they need to be focusing on, and not just the number. And also, as I mentioned earlier, justice. When you have evidence in cases that points to a person's innocence, that needs to be looked at, and it needs to be shared. That don't need to be withheld just to patent someone's resume based on someone else's misery. Sending an innocent person to prison is not justice. So it should be more about patenting the person's resume. It should be more about justice. Again, they spend a lot of time making a person look guilty, and they spend just as much time to make a person, if a person is innocent, they spend just as much as time to find out if that person is really innocent. So that needs to be looked at and not only talked about, but actually done.
Thank you. Before we go and before we give a final thank you to our panelists, I just want to say a few things. Thank you to the Coolidge for continuing to host important programs like this and important conversations like this, as well as, you know, from the folks in the executive suite of the Coolidge, as it were, but also to the folks that run the concessions and the ticket booth, and the folks that are filming this, and Mark, my buddy over here, and also just keeping in mind that there are other events here and other films here, and so we want to continue to be here, so we want to make sure that this place is as clean when we leave it as it was when we came in, all right? So let's make sure we take what we brought in here with us. But thank you to the staff of the Coolidge. If we can give it up for them, that'd be really terrific. Thank you all once again for being here, and thank you for being part of this. See you next time.